The carriage wheels crushed the frozen mud beneath them, and Baron Wilhelm Rothschild didn't even glance at the skeletal hands reaching toward his window. He'd stopped seeing the poor years ago. They'd become nothing more than scenery, like the bare winter trees or the grey stone walls of his estate. But on this particular December morning, as snow began to fall on the cobblestones of Lancaster Street, one beggar woman would shatter the ice that had formed around his heart, forcing him to remember what it felt like to be human. Wilhelm had inherited his title at 23, along with a fortune that could feed a small country. Now at 47, he ruled over textile mills that stretched across 3 states, employed thousands, and paid them just enough to keep them desperate. He believed poverty was a choice, a moral failing, evidence of weak character. The poor, he often said at his lavish dinner parties, were poor because they lacked ambition, intelligence, and discipline. His guests would nod politely, sipping wine that cost more than most families earned in a month. That morning, Wilhelm had business in the city's industrial district. His newest mill was underperforming, and heads would roll. As his driver navigated the narrow streets, Wilhelm reviewed termination papers, his fountain pen poised like a weapon. The carriage lurched to a halt. "What's the delay?" Wilhelm barked, rapping his cane against the roof. "Beggar woman in the road, sir," his driver called back. "She won't move." Wilhelm thrust open the door, fury propelling him onto the street. The cold hit him immediately, but his rage kept him warm. There, in the middle of the road, sat a woman so thin she seemed translucent. Her clothes were rags held together by sheer will. But it wasn't her poverty that stopped Wilhelm mid-stride. It was her eyes. They were the exact shade of amber his mother's had been. "Move!" he commanded, his voice hard as iron. The woman didn't flinch. She looked up at him with those impossible eyes and said, "I can't." "Can't or won't?" "Both." Her voice was surprisingly strong. "My daughter is dying in that alley." She pointed to a narrow gap between 2 warehouses. "I'm waiting for the doctor I sent for 3 hours ago. If I move, he won't find us." "Then wait on the sidewalk like a civilized person." The doctor said to stay visible from the main road. A single tear traced down her weathered cheek. "Please, she's only 7. Her name is Mary, and she has a fever that's burning her alive." Wilhelm should have climbed back into his carriage. He should have ordered his driver to go around. Instead, he found himself asking, "Where is this doctor?" "Dr. Patterson's office on 5th Street." Wilhelm knew 5th Street. Dr. Patterson was a competent physician who sometimes treated the poor for reduced rates. "That's 12 blocks from here." "I know." "He's not coming." The woman's face crumpled, but she didn't break. "Then I'll wait anyway, because what else can I do?" Something twisted in Wilhelm's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. Before he could stop himself, he was striding toward the alley. The woman scrambled to her feet and followed. The child lay on a pile of newspapers, her small body shaking with fever. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her breathing shallow. She couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds. Around her neck hung a tarnished locket, and Wilhelm's world tilted sideways. He knew that locket. He'd seen it every day of his childhood. "Where did she get that?" His voice came out strangled. The beggar woman's hand flew protectively to her daughter. "It was my mother's." "Why?" Wilhelm couldn't breathe. He was 20 years old again, standing in his childhood home, watching his mother press that same locket into a young maid's hands. "For your kindness," his mother had whispered. "For seeing me as human when everyone else saw only a title." The maid had been dismissed the next day. Wilhelm's father had discovered she'd been sneaking food to his mother during one of his cruel discipline periods when he'd restricted her meals. Wilhelm had done nothing to stop it. He'd been too afraid, too concerned with his inheritance, too much his father's son. "Your mother," Wilhelm said slowly, "was she in service at Rothschild Manor?" The woman's eyes widened. "You're him. You're the boy." Her voice filled with recognition and something else, not hatred, but disappointment, which was somehow worse. "She spoke of you sometimes, said you'd had kind eyes once. She wondered what happened to you." Wilhelm felt the careful walls he'd built crumbling. "What happened to her?" "She died when I was 12, worked herself to death in a factory." "Your factory?" The woman said it without accusation, just fact. The locket was all she left me, and now it's all I have to leave Mary." She knelt beside her daughter. If she lives, she'll live. Wilhelm was moving before conscious thought caught up with action. He scooped the burning child into his arms and strode toward his carriage. The girl weighed nothing. She was fever and bones and shallow breaths. "What are you doing?" the woman cried, running after him. "Taking her to a real hospital. My driver will bring you." Wilhelm was already shouting orders. "St. Catherine's Hospital, and don't spare the horses." The next hours passed in a blur. Wilhelm stood in the hospital corridor, still wearing his expensive coat now soaked with the poor child's sweat, while doctors worked frantically. The beggar woman, her name was Catherine, she'd told him, named for the saint, sat on a bench, her hands clasped in prayer. Wilhelm sat beside her. For the first time in 24 years, he really looked at poverty, saw past the statistics and moral judgments to the human cost. Catherine's hands were destroyed by factory work, her back bent from sleeping on streets. Her face aged beyond her 32 years, but her eyes held something his had lost long ago, hope. Despite everything, she still hoped. "Why didn't you curse me?" Wilhelm asked. "When you realized who I was?" Catherine looked at him with those amber eyes. "Would it have changed anything?" "No." "Then why waste the words?" She paused. "Besides, my mother taught me that people aren't born cruel. They learn it. She said you were kind once, that you cried when a stable boy was beaten. She believed that kindness was still in you somewhere. She was wrong." "Was she?" Catherine gestured toward the emergency room doors. "Then why are we here?" Wilhelm had no answer. Mary survived. The pneumonia that would have killed her was treated with medicines Catherine could never have afforded. But as the child recovered, Wilhelm found he couldn't walk away. He visited daily, bringing food, books, small toys. He listened to Catherine's stories about her mother, about the locket, about the life his family's wealth had denied them. Slowly, Wilhelm began to understand. Poverty wasn't a moral failing, it was a trap, baited with low wages and sprung by illness, injury, or misfortune. The poor weren't lazy. They worked harder than he ever had for a fraction of the reward. They weren't stupid. They made impossible choices with impossible wisdom. On Christmas Eve, Wilhelm stood in his library, surrounded by luxury purchased with their suffering. The termination papers still sat on his desk, waiting for his signature. Outside, snow fell on a city where children like Mary shivered in alleys. He thought of his mother, who had seen the humanity in a servant. He thought of that servant, who had passed that kindness to her daughter. He thought of Catherine, who had somehow transmitted hope to Mary, despite having every reason for despair. Wilhelm picked up his pen, but instead of signing terminations, he began to write new policies, fair wages, safe conditions, health care, housing. The words flowed like confession, like prayer, like the tears he'd been holding back for decades. When Catherine brought Mary to thank him, the child shy but healthy, clutching a new doll, Wilhelm knelt before them. "Your mother was right," he told Catherine. "The kindness was still there. I'd just buried it so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Thank you for helping me dig it up." "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. Wilhelm looked at the policies he'd drafted, the fortune he could redirect, the power he could finally use for good instead of greed. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the second chance you gave me." He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't bring back Catherine's mother or the thousands who'd suffered under his indifference. But he could change the future, one fair wage at a time, one safe workplace at a time, one family at a time. The Baron who had despised the poor learned that humanity isn't found in titles or bank accounts. It lives in the amber eyes of a beggar woman who chose forgiveness over hatred, in the fevered breath of a child too young to understand cruelty, in the tarnished locket that connected 3 generations of kindness. Wilhelm Rothschild died 20 years later, having given away most of his fortune to the workers who'd created it. At his funeral, thousands came, not because he'd been a baron, but because he'd finally learned to be human. Catherine was there, with Mary and Mary's own children. They laid a single flower on his grave, and tucked beneath it was an old, tarnished locket. Inside, if you looked closely, you could still read the inscription his mother had engraved so long ago. Kindness is never wasted. She'd been right all along.